What I'm going to be talking about today is the way that migrant communities, immigrant communities, refugee communities interact with the museum and with other public institutions, and the place that museums can play in the processes of arrival and integration and inclusion in communities. Now, I'm not an expert on museums. I've been doing some interesting work lately that I'll talk about with some museums, but certainly for the rest of today on Monday and the rest of the week as well, we'll be hearing a lot of examples of museums doing really interesting work in the migration space, you could say. So I will leave that expertise to you. So what I'm going to talk about is how newcomer communities become part of an existing community, an existing economy, an existing society, and the place that museums can play in being part of that process of inclusion, and the absence of institutions like museums can play in being obstacles to that inclusion. Now, as the title of today suggests, my unit of analysis is what I call the arrival city, which is the place where immigration occurs in cities. The arrival city is a city within a city created by immigrants and their communities. It's important to understand that immigration is never a process of people moving from one country to another country at random. People never do that. What happens is specific clusters of people, clusters of villages in ascending country, clusters of urban neighborhoods in ascending country, link themselves up to clusters of people of the same culture and background and immigration experience in specific urban neighborhoods in the receiving country, and they join together and create networks of mutual support, sending back and forth between the two countries, sending knowledge and people and money and communication about jobs and things like that. So for example, as I noted in Arrival City, the specific blocks of southern Los Angeles are mapped to specific clusters of villages in Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras. Specific neighborhoods in North and West London are mapped to specific villages in Silesia and Southwest Poland. And so on. And I can map my own Toronto neighborhood to specific parts of the Azores in Portugal, specific parts of Korea, specific parts of southern China that the people who live there have come from, and those links remain existing for a long time after it. And a lot of the success or failure of migration depends on the resources that the arrival city has, whether it's allowed to exist as a legitimate community, whether it's recognized by the existing city as a legitimate community, and so on. Sometimes arrival cities are known as slums or barrios or favelas or shanty towns or and so on. Sometimes they're known as ghettos or crime-ridden immigrant neighborhoods and things like that. They are self-created economies and social connections that have been crucial to arrival. I mean, it's sort of important to understand that the process of people clustering together by background is part of the process of integration. It's central to it. And in looking at these districts, I'm looking at both the places that are created by internal migration from rural to urban areas and places across the West. So for example, here in Mexico City, there are many large districts that were created during the 20th century by people moving from rural areas of Mexico, forming informal, at the first illegal settlements of housing that slowly built up their own internal economies and social structures and so on, and eventually became legitimate parts of the city, to some extent included. Here we are in Mexico City, and I'm serving second duty as IT support here. So the arrival city includes districts that are created by internal migration within countries, such as here in Mexico City, here in the center of the world's fastest growing city, Dhaka, Bangladesh, here in the city of 20 million in the center of China, Chongqing. This is a migrant-created district of 200,000 people, and so on. But it also refers to the districts created by the process of international immigration. When immigrants arrive internationally, they create very similar structures and institutions to those that are developed internally. Let's see what's happening here. Just to back up here. Now, we're saying, if we're looking at how people are immigrating into cities and forming communities, we need to look at these districts that they create and the networks of support they create, which I call arrival cities. Again, places of internal migration in the global south and east, but also the districts created by immigrants who move internationally, who sometimes are very often are part of that urbanizing trend around the world, which happens across international borders, but who also, even if they're from educated backgrounds and so on, in the countries that they come from, tend to find the need to create these networks of mutual support in the first and second generations in order to use the resources of the city around them to become included. Because there's a built-in logic of immigration, even fairly educated and high-income international immigration, that you're going to be starting off with an income and a set of social capital far below that of the city you're coming to, yet you're somehow going to have to afford to live there. So people tend to settle in the places that for some reason have housing costs that are far below those of the established city, and where they have resources available that they can use to create internal economies and social structures. So for example, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, these districts in cities like New York became arrival cities for often people from 7 or 8 different language groups and national backgrounds and religions and cultures, usually deeply distrusted by the city that they settled in, usually using the space of the city around them to create business, to create housing opportunities, and so on, so that by the time 3 generations had passed, they had become part of the established culture of the city. The same applies in Paris, here in my old neighborhood of Kensington Market in Toronto, which saw first Eastern European Jews and then Southern Chinese, then Vietnamese, now Central Americans become the poor immigrant groups who use the retail space around them to create connections in life. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, there's a problem in the Western countries that those classic densely populated neighborhoods where people arrive, the old Little Italies and Chinatowns and so on, no longer are places where immigration happens because of the success of those places. So neighborhoods like the Lower East Side or Kensington Market or Kreuzberg and Neukölln in Berlin or Brick Lane in London are no longer places that people immigrating from countries can afford to live. However, they are places where the people who immigrated in the 20th century have benefited from that rise in value. I mean, the main beneficiaries of gentrification in the West are the poor immigrants who were the purchasers of the housing and so on. We'll talk a little bit about that. Anyway, for people looking at becoming part of immigrant communities or making interventions that can support them, there needs to be a recognition that immigration is now a suburban phenomenon in all of North America and most of Western Europe and many other developed places as well. And it's a set of living patterns that are not as easy as the previous generations, in large part because of the very low population density of the high-rise districts in the suburbs and things like that, the poor transportation connections. You could say that immigrants can no longer do the immigrant thing, which is to move into a place like this, to move into an undesirable neighborhood, to purchase your housing, to start a small shop or restaurant or small factory on the ground floor, or maybe even in the building where you live, and to use the rise in value of that business, the rise in value of your property, the income from your business to finance this post-secondary education of your children. That's the classic Western model of immigrant integration, is the use of rising values of housing and small business to create social connections. And in the new suburbanized immigration, those connections are much more difficult. You often can't purchase the units, even though immigrants usually want to buy housing at a much greater rate than native-born people. There's no place to start a small business inside these buildings. Even if you did start a small business, there's no middle-class people walking past constantly on the street with money in their pockets and so on. There's no subway connection and that sort of thing. So we're seeing problems with disconnected communities that are unable to do what immigrant groups did in the 20th century, even though the groups moving into the West now have higher educations and tend to be middle class. I mean, even the people taking the boats across the Mediterranean, they're middle-class people. They've paid 3,000 euros each to go on those boats and that sort of thing. But they're finding themselves trapped in districts like that because of the geographic realities of them, because of some changing economic realities in the structure of labor markets and what's allowed in creating businesses, and because of political changes and so on. So we need to look at how the part that institutions, notably museums, can play in being part of this process of arriving, of becoming part of the city. This is a grid I created. I did a project with the World Bank over the last couple of years where we looked at obstacles to integration of migrants to Western cities. And the flip side of obstacles, of course, is that we looked at the resources that people use after first settling in a city to become part of the established city's economy and political system and social system and so on. So if you flip all of these things around, the lack of these things are barriers. So when families arrive in a new country, they have a specific pathway in mind. As I said, people never randomly show up in a country. People never settle thinking, I'm just going to sit back and collect benefits or something like that, because it's a very expensive risk to make an international migration. Even if you're fleeing a war and you're coming as a refugee, you're taking an enormous risk. Usually it's the most ambitious people, the people who've saved the most money, who tend to come. And immigrants are always looking for three things when they choose a place to settle. And this is even true of refugees when they choose a place to flee to. The first thing they look for is known employment or business opportunities. Very often business opportunities. Immigrants today tend to create businesses that employ people rather than serving as units of labor in factories. But they exchange SMS messages and that sort of thing. Somebody from their background says, look, here's a place where you can get a job, or where you could start a shop selling this or that, and so on. The second thing they look for is networks of people from the same background, speaking the same language, from the same culture, who can help them out, loan them money, give them a room to sleep in during their first months, help their kids get into the school, all these other things. And the third thing they look for is housing that they can afford to live in, usually at a lower price than the average cost. Now, the one thing immigrants will always give up of those three things is the third one. People will always live in a place they cannot afford to live if they have those other two factors, if they have employment opportunities and networks of people, which is why immigrants don't settle in failed post-industrial cities and so on. You don't see immigrants going to Bulgaria or Portugal from Northern Africa, even though those are the closest places. You see them crossing 5 other countries to go to somewhere where there are networks of people and where there are things. People do not want to live somewhere just because the housing's affordable. And that's important to recognize. People will always give up affordable housing in exchange for those other things. So if we look at this grid of things, there are physical needs that people have. People need to have a house, and ideally they need to have a house that they feel that they own eventually. People need to be able to invest in their community. People need to have transportation connections, not just to get to jobs and so on, but so that customers can get to their small businesses and that sort of thing. There are institutional needs, which is our subject of conversation today. There needs to be full inclusion in schools. There needs to be schools designed to encourage the children of immigrants to stay in school for a long period. And there need to be the institutions of inclusion, and we'll focus on those a bit. Libraries, community centers, museums. I have to say the first two get more emphasis today. Libraries, of course, have become the absolute central instruments of integration in many cities. We've seen it with the death of the printed book. We've seen a renaissance in libraries because they've taken on a new function as places of acculturation and connection and integration. You certainly see that in any of the cities of the West. If you go to a public library, you recognize that this has become the places where networks are built. Community centers serve similar purposes, and fundamentally, museums can serve this purpose as well, whether they are located in the district or otherwise. And we've seen some good examples, and I think we'll be hearing about some good examples of museums that have begun to serve this function, but there's not enough of them. There are not enough places, and we'll talk about some of those barriers in a bit. Finally, the other instruments people need are economic instruments, the ability to open a legal small business quickly without licensing or too many rules or requirement that is huge and necessary. I wrote an article recently about the man who invented Europe's most popular form of fast food, the doner kebab, which was invented in 1971 in Berlin by this guy from Turkey, who died 3 years ago in poverty, living in a basement of a relative. He could have been the Ray Kroc of Europe. You know, Ray Kroc's the guy who created McDonald's, who died a billionaire. But because he was never allowed to be a citizen, because he was a so-called guest worker, because he was not allowed to patent his invention, to create a legal business, to even have a bank account and so on, he was unable to profit from it, and so on. So ability to create a business, ability to get hired by existing businesses, and political instruments, pathways to legal citizenship quickly, ideally before you've learned the language, a voice in the governing process, and recognition of your educational credentials and so on. So that's sort of the matrix of resources that we look at, because we recognize that when immigrants arrive, they have a dotted line going from the village they came from, through the place they're living now, through the arrival city, to an established life in the city that they've arrived in, to a place in the lower rungs of the middle class, to a place where their children have an education and they're an established part of the city. And they all know, when you visit people and talk to people, just yesterday I was visiting people on some of the remote housing projects of Mexico City, they all had the story about where their parents came from, the village their parents came from, how they started, what they expected for their children. They knew that dotted line, and they knew the obstacles in the way of it. Okay, my house, it takes 2 hours on the bus to get to my job. And when I'm on the bus for 2 hours, my children, they only have this empty space between these buildings, and no surprise if they join a gang or something like that, right? These are the obstacles on the way of the dotted line, and the obstacles usually fill into one of these things. So the place that institutions can play and museums can play is in removing some of those obstacles to people's pathway to success. It's worth talking to the people in migration communities to ask them what the barriers are on their trajectory to success, because they all have an answer to that question. Again, yes, this is what we were talking about. The barriers to integration create intergenerational problems. The big worry is whether what they call the second generation, the generation born in the city that they've migrated to, have pathways to get out. I mean, the parents have usually done the starting things, settled themselves by having housing, having some form of income, having a neighborhood to live in, but there are too many incentives that stop the second generation from moving along that trajectory, from making the next step into the higher ranks of the educational system, into inclusion in the society around them. And by the way, that's Antwerp in Belgium. So what do we do when communities get stuck or they feel they don't have a pathway forward? I've examined a lot of interventions that have worked and investments that have worked. I mean, part of my argument is that It's much less expensive to have an intervention now, to put an institution in place now, or to change the physical shape of a neighborhood now, or to put transportation in now, than to pay for the social and economic costs of that a generation or two down the line, when you could have enormous social service costs, policing costs, and things like that. And it's worth the argument for governments that the investment of institutions in migration communities will solve a lot of expenses later on down the road. So a lot of the things we're looking at is transforming the built communities. That slide I showed you about the suburbanization of immigration, showing that low-rise apartment building with the big grassy space between them. There's a lot of really interesting initiatives I'm looking at to eliminate those grassy spaces between the housing buildings. The empty space, I mean, I sort of have an argument now that the empty spaces between buildings are the biggest social problem in the Western world right now. They prevent communities from cohering together and from joining the established communities. They are a specifically gendered problem, these empty grassy spaces, because women in communities feel it's unsafe to leave the building, to join the world, to link up with other women in the community, and so on. And it's a problem that creates intergenerational problems. So what they did in that Amsterdam neighborhood with the big grassy forested areas between the buildings is get rid of the grassy forested areas, recreate the sort of physical space of immigration neighborhoods that have succeeded, like the Lower East Side in New York, like Brick Lane in London, and that sort of thing. Say 8, 9, 10-story buildings on a tight grid pattern. The bottom 2 floors are allowed to be shops or restaurants or factories or museums, and they have close connection to the existing, and the population density is about 4 times higher than it was before, because low population density is the enemy of integration and so on. So you turn what was an isolated, frightened community, disconnected from the city, into a tight-knit, dense, connected community with a sense of coherence and self-help with its own internal economies within the space. And part of what they also did with this in filling in the empty spaces between buildings was adding institutions between buildings. And this is a type of intervention that's become very popular now. And in this case, it's a museum. So they had an empty courtyard in that corner of those apartment buildings. It had become a place that people were afraid to walk in. People didn't want to leave those apartments after dark and walk across that courtyard because there were gangs hanging out. There were mysterious guys with tattoos and dogs and that sort of thing. And what they did was they created this thing, which is a museum. No, it's not a museum. It's a library/community center. But it's the sort of thing where a museum could be put in. I'm involved in a project right now in Toronto, where I live now, to create something like this, to put a museum into a place in Kensington Market, the traditional immigrant neighborhood, to take over an old parking lot and to build a museum of immigration and inclusion in that place that will also be a reproduction of sort of the daily life of people there. So it'll be a museum that doesn't feel like a museum, an extension of the public space. But it's even more valuable to do these sort of things in the suburban places where actual immigration occurs now, and so on. So what else can museums do in a place like this? An important part, and I think what we'll be hearing a lot about today, is including the newcomer communities of migration in the community of the museum, and in using the spaces and resources it has. So one small example here, this is the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, one of the newest museums, which suffers a lot of the problems that older museums do, that it's a very elite space, very expensive, very physically sort of designed to be accessible to people with money. And it's tried to break through those barriers by recognizing it's right next door to sort of one of the ultimate arrival city districts, Thorncliffe Park, which has been an apartment immigration district for hundreds of different nationalities of people over the years, and right now is a place for arrival for people from the Indian subcontinent and Afghanistan and so on, so people who have a connection. So they created, among other things, a large photography club, which was an interesting way to bring people in who might not, from migration communities, who might not otherwise be interested in joining a museum community, but that also ties them to the existing resources of the museum and so on. So they reached out to the community opportunity for that. I'm sure a lot of you know examples of things like that that if the museum's at least not located in the place where immigration occurs, reaches out to that place and brings those people in. Of course, the other thing that could be done is making current migration experiences of the people who live in your city part of the museum's content. And we've seen a lot of that recently. This is the Värmlands Museum in Karlstad, Sweden, which recognized there was a huge refugee influx into Karlstad and the region, and it did a large exhibition devoted to the ongoing migration experience in Europe and encouraged the people arriving in Karlstad to participate in that. And I've seen a lot of good examples of that sort of thing. Because there used to be a tendency to look at museums and immigration as looking at things that happened in the past, rather than things that are happening now. Now, a lot of the museums, the specific museums of immigration and museums of emigration have done a lot of really interesting work lately to bring current migration experiences into their content. And I'm sure we'll hear about that as well, but that can be an important part of it. I mean, it's sort of a matter of breaking through. I mean, somebody asked me, why is it that museums have a more difficult time becoming part of these communities than libraries and community centers and so on have? And there's sort of, I mean, all of you know this, there's a built-in structural problem with a lot of museums in making those changes, in that museums are often either left with the legacy of their historic creation, of the sort of colonial type collection of plunder model that they were built on a century ago, or they are sort of prisoners of the current people funding them and sitting on their boards who have interests of their own and that sort of thing. And it's much harder to break free from those two limitations for museums than it is otherwise. But it can be done, and I think we'll be hearing about some of that today. Let me, to end this off, talk to you a little bit about my own recent experience in attempting to turn the things I write about into a museum exhibition. This started out as the Germany pavilion for the Venice Architecture Biennale, and it's now a international museum exhibition, traveling museum exhibition financed by the Goethe Institute. Essentially, what me and the people from the Deutsche Architecture Museum and some other partners set out to do was to take my book Arrival City and turn it into a building-sized exhibition, but one that included the migrant communities I was talking about in both the process and in the content, which we did imperfectly. But we did this because, and we were invited to do this by the German government because, of course, they were having the experience of having had 1 million people walk across their border, and at least 400,000 of those people applied to settle in their country over a very short period of time. They were building 400,000 units of housing per year for the next 10 years. They were sort of the largest experiment in emergency migration settlement was taking place in Germany, and this was an opportunity to do a museum exhibit that wasn't about something that had happened, but something that was in the process of happening. And we set it up as sort of a best. Well, first of all, we decided to change the physical space that we were in. We recognized we had a large cubic museum building built in the 1930s in sort of, well, it was fascist architectural style. It was the style that was popular then. And we recognized that what we needed to do was turn it into the sort of place where migration happens. So transform it into a place that feels like one of those open air markets that Turkish and Moroccan migrants used. So we demolished the walls of the existing building. This being Venice, we were required to keep every single brick. So we built these large lintel beams across them. Being Venice, we were required to save every brick that we removed from this building and replace it at the end. And it cost many hundreds of thousands of euros just to put those holes in the wall. But it created an open air space, which we then filled with, we created an immigrant market environment. We used cheap raw materials, piles of bricks, shipping pallets, plastic stacking chairs, and so on. We brought in Turkish vendors from the markets of of Berlin and Offenbach and places like that, and musicians and so on, and so sort of created the actual thing we were trying to describe, so people would have a feeling, and then made it an exhibit of sort of best practices in turning migrant districts into successful places from across Europe and North America. And we got the communities involved in it. We did a project with Offenbach, which is a large immigrant settlement district on the other side of the river from Frankfurt in Germany, that is often a distrusted place in Germany. It's seen as a place of crime and social troubles and so on. In fact, it has a very low crime rate, as most of these places do. But we brought the members of that community on board to create an exhibition in it called Offenbach is Almost All Right, which is an architecture inside joke, and so on. And we created a space that would function as that type of immigration environment, not just by having actual migrant people selling things there, but actually trying to create those attractions. So we created informal spaces with free Wi-Fi and places to do work that would encourage people to walk through the holes in the wall and use it as a place to hang out and do stuff and create their own networks within the space and so on. So in a way, it was an experiment in breaking down the structure of a museum. It was easier to do in Venice because you could actually remove all the exterior walls from a building and not have snow blow through it. With this Toronto thing that we're working on, we talked about doing that, and we recognized some of the climate problems would be prohibitive, but part of it would be creating open air spaces that would feel like continuations of the traditional community there rather than a disruption of the traditional community there. So, and it's interesting to see how that exhibition is unfolding in different cities. As it's going to Mumbai next month, and then in the summer it'll be in Cairo and that sort of thing. It'll be very interesting to see how those communities transform that exhibition to do it. So this is a very brief survey, really, of the different ways that museums can inject themselves into the migration space. But I would say that in summary, if you're stepping back and looking at ways museums can be involved, it's worth remembering this idea of a migrant trajectory, that the communities of newcomers, the communities of migration, the arrival cities in your city are not simply collections of people. They're not statistics on a table. They're not just units of housing or units of wealth or poverty, but that they are people who have that dotted line in their mind, who see themselves as coming from a place that they're still connected to and probably will be connected to for a couple more generations. They see themselves where they're living now and the circumstances they're living in now as being a temporary stepping stone, a place of initial arrival, a place to build the first and second generation. And they see that dotted line continuing into a place where they have a secure living, a secure place to live, and that they are a well-connected and contributing and accepted part of the existing social and political and economic world of the city around them. And that they have barriers. They have things that are getting in the way, that are speed bumps on that dotted line to success. And asking, how can your institution play a part in that? How can you remove some of those barriers? How can you help people along that line? Partly helping people tell their story and understand their story is part of that, but also helping make them become part of a community of knowledge, of a community of institutions, of a museum community is another very important part of making people feel included. So thank you, everyone. I look forward to hearing for the rest of the day how museums around the world are doing this, are building themselves into migration communities around them and telling their stories. Thank you very much. They were applauding me, weren't they?
Thank you so much, Doug. That was really a terrific introduction. Great way to get us started here. And I apologize for the technical difficulties, but you rose to the challenge admirably, so thank you. Yanni? Yeah, come. What is that noise?
Well, in the first place, I would like to apologize for the technical issues that we've had here, and I would like to especially apologize, Doug. Okay. Well, I would like to ask you, though, and I'll say it in Spanish. Do you have your translators, or would you like me to do it in English? The question is the following. We have, as I imagine many of you also have, the type of community museum. And we've developed it for a long, long time. It's very, very similar to what you very interesting explained to us. And many of these small community museums do serve the migration that come from out of the city to the city and have the same purpose. So I would like to know exactly if there is a difference between one and another.
There are good examples of these community museums, which are different sorts of museums. I mean, here in Mexico City, they have a specific form of organization and function. And that's coming from outside. I thought that was coming from the microphone. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Now, in a lot of countries, this sort of community museum is rare, right? You don't see them, and it's fairly new here as well. Part of it is you don't really get a community museum until you recognize a community as being a legitimate part of your city, right? In a lot of countries, communities of internal migration are not recognized as being legitimate parts of the city. You know, this was part of the process in Brazil, in recognizing the favelas in the big cities as being legitimate parts of the city. There was a rejection of the people from the Northeast who had settled in those cities as being legitimate people. They were seen as being accidental people, or people who were temporary, or who were a sort of cancer on the side of the city, or something like that. It took a generation, the past generation, to sort of recognize that these were actually communities of people who were part of their city. This was not illegal housing. This was something that was permanent, and so on. So this slowly develops. Yeah. No, I feel like enthusiastic. I feel like I should score a penalty kick or something like that. Yeah. No, it's part of the community, right? And but there's different sorts of community museums. There are those that are sort of created from above to make a museum of these people who settled here and so on, which occasionally only play sort of token recognition of the actual people there. In a lot of places you see those. They're the ones created by the community itself, which often which sometimes are fantastic. Sometimes they lack resources though, because they're autonomous attempts to preserve their own memory of their background and of their stories. And that sort of thing. In many countries, those sort of museums need support. And often there's a divide between those official top-down museums and these sort of grassroots museums. They don't speak to each other, they don't work interactively, and so on. I don't know how well it works in Mexico, right? I think you have a better system of organization for that than a lot of other countries do. But those sort of community museums are lacking in so many places, really. And sometimes the word museum is not necessarily the word to apply to it either. Because for the communities themselves, that word implies a static place, rather than a place that is an active place of engagement and that sort of thing. It's worth thinking about lots of examples where they've decided to call it something like, you know, something experience or experiment or something like that, or a center for, or something like that. It's worth thinking about how it's presented to the community, because so many museums of particular communities, people who are actually current members of that community, particularly in low-income areas, don't participate in them because they see it as something about previous generations. You know.